There is a scene in One Punch Man where Saitama is punched to the moon and then he flies back onto Earth. He nearly destroys the moon trying to do that. It's a very, very amazing scene that showcases his power. And we're going to try and recreate something like that using Blender. Rebaway, a Houdini VFX channel, has done this scene already, recreating it into a live action sequence using Houdini. They have a 2-hour tutorial that takes you through the process in Houdini, but we're going to try and recreate the same thing using the same concepts they teach in that tutorial, but make this shorter and inside Blender. You can take a look at their version. All links are going to be in the description. So let's get started. So we're going to need a moon, Saitama, some destruction, a smoke simulation, talk about some volumetrics and other effects, and then add rocks. Check out the project files if you want to examine the project in detail. So let's start with the moon. All we need is a UV sphere, scale it up, line up your camera in position. You want to do this early in your effect so that you know where to focus. Rotate your UV sphere so that this dot is the center where Saitama is going to jump from. I need more subdivisions on my moon, so I'll use Ctrl 2, and I can even apply the subdivisions. You can even start setting up your lights. I'll go to the render view here, go to the world settings, remove my strength, and add an area light. Scale it up, rotate it, and just push it to the back, increase its strength to about 100. I like that highlight. Let me make it more pronounced by giving this about 1000. Scale it and position it where you want. I'll also shade smooth. Let's create a new material, call this moon, and import in a moon texture. We need to create 2 UV maps. Call the first one projected and create another one. Let's go to the projected and look at the moon directly like this. Use U and use project from view so that we have a UV map like this. Since my moon texture is just an image of the moon, this type of UV is great. So I can just scale it up and make sure that it aligns with our moon. It just gives me a lot of detail that I need. But this is not enough. Bring in another moon texture. If we use the same UV map, we get stretching. So let's go to the second UV map we created. So I'll just bring in a UV map node, select the second UV map we created, and just plug that in. But I don't like this pinching going on here, so I'll just unwrap using sphere projection. This should give me a better UV map, and I can scale this down up until I have an interesting look. I can blend these together and I can decide what I want more. I'll just use a blend of the two, plug this into the base color. We have something like that. You can even plug this into the bump to add extra detail. And just look at this in the render. It starts to look like the moon. You can even try a different image like this. So just bring that in, make sure I'm using the same UV map, and I can use a mix node to mix these two, and I can choose which one I want to use. I think this gives us better detail for the moon. This side is too dark, so I'm just going to duplicate this light and rotate it around so that it lights the other side. Now let's work on the atmosphere. I'm just going to duplicate this moon using Shift D, scale it up a bit, and call it atmosphere. I'll remove the material, create a new one, call it volume, remove the principal, add a volume shader. I can give this a bluish color, make it quite strong, and that's what we have. We might also want to increase the strength of our lights. Since I want to work with the moon, I can hide the atmosphere or change its visibility to wireframe, but it's still getting in the way, so I'm just going to create a collection, call it extras, and move that there so that I can disable that when I'm working on the moon. Now let's work on the destruction. There are several ways you can make destruction in Blender, but we're going to use the simplest, which is using the explode modifier. To do that, we need a particle system and an explosion modifier. If we hit play, things start breaking apart. We want everything to stay in place, so remove physics, change the physics type to none. Now everything stays intact. I can change the display to remove those dots. Just set the render as to object and don't set an instance of object. Turn on size to control the size of the chunks using the particle size. So if I go to the particle settings, I can play with the size. I don't like that the cuts just look very cookie cut like this. So what I'm going to do is add a triangulate modifier above the explode, add a decimate modifier above the explode but below the triangulate, and remove some of the vertices to make this even look more organic. I can go back to the particles, set this back to 1, just duplicate this as a backup, add it in a backup collection. We want these chunks to have some thickness, so add a solidify modifier. You can check out what this is doing by changing the particle size to see how these chunks look. I think that's the size I want. Change this back to 1, select the mesh, use Ctrl A, visuals to geometry. This will apply all the modifiers. I can right click and use shade auto smooth, and I can also tab into edit mode, select everything and use P, separate by loose parts, and that will separate each chunk. I can select one of these, right click, and then reset origin to geometry. Move them into a collection, call it moon parts. You can also turn on random colors to see the different chunks that make up your moon. Let's make sure that the materials and textures look correct, and that's great. Now let's create some physics using geometry nodes. I'll disable this collection and add a plane. Go to geometry node, create a new geometry nodes, and import our moon's path. You can preview that. Make sure that you separate children and turn on relative. Basically back to where we started. Use a set position and a noise texture. Connect this directly to the offset, and everything will be randomly moved. But the noise adds an offset, so let me subtract that using a vector math. Subtract 0.5. I can scale this using a scale node to increase the strength of our noise. I can even add a rotate instance to randomize the rotation of these instances using a random value set to vector and plugged into the rotation. The minimum can be -2 and the maximum can be simply 2. If I want the rotation to be animated, I can add vector math and use a sync time and plug the seconds into the vector. Now if I hit play, they all rotate. I can slow this down using a scale node, 0.4. But every chunk has moved randomly and is also rotated randomly. We only want the chunks where Saitama is going to land or jump from to be affected. So let's create a distance mask that will influence the rotation and position of each chunk using its distance from Saitama. So I'm just going to add an empty to represent Saitama. Let me also align him correctly. I'm going to animate him of him jumping from there to space. I can bring that empty Saitama as an object into our geometry node, set it to relative, create a mask using the position of each node. Just connect the location of the object and the position of each node and change this to distance. This will give us a mask that we can control. Map the distance to a range using a map range. So let's try 20, and also make sure that you're previewing instances to see what the mask is doing. That changes as Saitama jumps away. I can use a ramp to control how this looks. And now I can use this mask to control the noise. Add this here, plug this mask here. Let me remove the preview for a second. Let's first disable the rotation. So only look at the position. I can see anything close to Saitama is intact, but we want the opposite. So I'm going to flip the range so that chunks far are not moved at all. And I can even just use the maximum here. We also need to use this for the rotation. So let me activate the rotation again. We're also going to reverse the effect so that the moon is destroyed when Saitama jumps. So let's select this and just reverse this animation. Perfect. This effect will look even better if we push most of these inside when Saitama jumps. For that, we're going to need the surface normal of this mesh. And for that, we can go back to the extras and use our atmosphere. Drag in our atmosphere, and we're going to use the surface normals of this geometry and transfer it to our moon. That way we can scale the moon parts in the normal direction using a set position about here. Bring in the normal, plug it into the offset. Nothing happens because our moon chunks are just instances. We need to get the normals from the nearest surface, which is our atmosphere. Nearest surface node, change this to vector, use the atmosphere as the mesh, the normal as the data, and now I can plug this into this, and you can see this pushes these out. But I also want to use the same mask. Now I can just grab a scale and use our mask to control that. I think we need to be pushing these in instead of out, so I'll just use another scale here, but this time pushing that in, just like that. Another thing we could do is clear the atmosphere on impact. To do that, let's just duplicate this empty, remove the keyframes, and we're going to use that to create a mask to remove some of that atmosphere. So let's go to the atmosphere, go to the shader, bring in that second empty, a gradient texture, add coordinate mapping, use object, and this time select the second empty we created. If I look at this mask, this is what we have. I can change this to sphere, and you can see now I can use the empty to control the scale of the sphere. I need to invert this using a ramp, so flip. And now if I use this in the density, we should see that that clears that area. So when I scale this, that also clears. So I just need to set a keyframe. Now let's make this fake dust that ejects out of the moon. I'm going to start with a simple plane, add a subdivisions, apply that, just subdivide it again, select the middle vertex, turn on proportional editing, and drag this up. We can even add another subdivision surface, and we can also add a displacement modifier, add a clouds texture. So we have something like that. Shade smooth, apply subdivisions, and maybe even add a second one. Scale this up. You can bring this to the target, and this is also going to be animated to scale up on impact. So at frame 15 can be there. At frame 10, it can be really shrink up. So give this a volume shader. For volume, one is not enough. So I'm just going to go to the keyframes and just delete rotation and position keyframes so that I only have the scale. Now I can easily duplicate this, Shift D, and rotate it in different angles. Now we have that. So these need to continue up slowly. So just select them, add a scale keyframe, continue to be scaled. Also, this volume can also continue clearing slowly. And now let's create this wave of particles, small rocks, and then a wave of dust. So for that, let's go to the center, add a circle, scale it up, and just rotate it to align with the sphere, just like that. Go to edit mode, hit F, and then insert this a few times. Select the middle face. I want to project this onto the atmosphere, so let's add a shrink wrap. Select the atmosphere as our target so that this wraps on top of it. We can change the wrap method to project. That way we can project this directly and also just scale it. So I'll animate this to be very small in the beginning, then it scales up on impact to around there, just still being projected onto the surface. I want for it to continue slowly, just like that. Now there are a ton of things we could do here and turn this into a wave. First, UV unwrapping this, select one face, make it the active face, unwrap it, and then select everything and use U follow active chord to make this unwrap in a straight line, just like that. Use a gradient, Ctrl T, change this to UV, and I think we need to rotate this. Yeah, so that the gradient is fading just like that. I can use this as alpha mask, and I can also turn on some emission, but I need this to be flipped. I need to use a ramp to add another note here. Just make a mask that looks just like that, so that we create a simple wave that propagates on the surface. Now I can use a noise texture, use vector math, and plug the color of the noise into the add. Just use multiply, and now I can just play around with this ramp to get a nice wave effect. Now I can scale the noise up a bit, maybe add some roughness, change this to 4D, and play with this value with W. Use frame divide by 100 to animate the noise. Maybe that's too much. Let's try 1000. Now if we look at this, we get a secondary wave on impact. So something like that. Okay, now let's add these rocks. Add a plane, add a new geometry node setup, bring in our circle or gradient, set it to relative. Now let's preview that. Can just look at this here. Instance on points, so that we can turn it vertices into points. Just find a rock in your library, bring that rock, use it as the instance, random scale, random rotation. We need more subdivisions on the mesh. Use the random value, change this to Boolean to delete some of the points. We get a wave of rocks that get pushed up. We can have the rotation animated by just using vector math, set to add, and use the time plugged into the second vector, just like that. Now we start them clamped here. Bring in a vector node, set to scale to control the size of these. You can either animate the scale of this or just use a map range to map the frames to the range of your timeline. So I want these to start off at frame 12 and scale up to frame 80. So this can be 0 to 1. Just plug that in, just like that. And now they start invisible and then they explode into particles. Guess I need to make these a bit larger, just like that. The material doesn't seem to match, so I'm going to change that a bit. Add a hue and saturation node, bring down the saturation, and I can also go back to our gradient here, change the color a bit to make it moon-like. Okay, these seem to scale up quite a lot. Now this should be scaled to 1. Let's add this dust simulation. We have this circle here and it has all the animation we need. You can come in here, give it a fluid system, flow, inflow, and set an initial velocity. Set the normal to something like 0.1. And now let's create our domain, which is just a cube. Just align it, scale it up. Doesn't have to be that large, just has to contain our scene. Give it a fluid domain. It seems to be flipped, so I'll rotate it in the Z 180 degrees, just like that. Now if I simulate, we can see smoke already. Now I can come in here, turn on adaptive domain, add in some viscosity, bring the buoyance down so that the smoke is not rising too fast. Let's do 0.1. We don't have to emit all the way. We can select our circle, which is our emitter. Emit at frame 11, so we can animate the flow source to be off before 11. Emits up to around frame 22, so you can turn it off at frame 23. Perfect. Select our emitter, bring the initial temperature to 0.05 so that the smoke is really heavy like dust. So if the smoke is moving too fast, we can scale down the time. So let's try 0.5. You can even start working with the material. So let's go to the shader, give this a volume, principal volume, increase the density, maybe give it more brownish look. We can increase the resolution, 128. Now if the smoke is emitted very smoothly, what we can do is select our emitter and give it a displacement modifier. Go into that, give it a clouds texture, just like that. We can add a subdivision surface on top of this. And since this is subdivided, we have to go back to our rocks, geometry nodes, and reduce the subdivisions we have there. You can also just make sure the fluid is below everything else. Another thing we could do to control the speed is just duplicate this smoke emitter. Let me just call it smoke or dust and just change the animation so that this doesn't scale too far. I'll scale this down and I'm going to remove the smoke simulation from the original emitter. That way we are only emitting from our dust mesh and making sure that this dust mesh doesn't scale too far. So yeah, I think that gives us better results. Now I can remove the displacement on our original mesh, reduce the rocks, and make sure that this dust emitter is not a renderable object. You just have to adjust the different settings to make sure that this looks good. And to add this extra line, you just have to duplicate one of these, and just shrink them on the X and Y plane. Scale them on the Z so that this becomes really thin, like a thin line. Animate the camera, add some shakes, and you get a really nice effect. Thanks for watching. Project files are going to be in the description on my Gumroad, Patreon, and my YouTube membership page. Thank you. See you in the next video.